data. So Patryk, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, and good luck with your presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and it's shaping up to be an exciting Welsh Esports League campaign. So we'll have to see how the rest of the season unfolds. But yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Patryk Białowós. I'm, as has been mentioned, I'm one of the founders of S.E.A Dragons Esports, which is a data-driven esports team, and I'm also a BSc Sports Performance Analysis student at Cardiff Metropolitan University as well. Today, I just want to thank everyone at the Esports Research Network as well first. It's been a very exciting live stream, and it's looking like it's going to be a very exciting event as well as it continues on. But today I'm going to be presenting my research into whose game is it anyway, data ownership, protection, ethics, and current practices in grassroots esports performance analysis. This research examined how clubs, coaches, and players at grassroots and semi-professional levels collect, manage, and understand performance data, and how ethical practices often lag behind the rapid growth of analysis technology as well. Over the course of the study, I gathered survey, interview, and policy data from multiple esports clubs and compared these findings to traditional sports examples as well. The presentation today summarizes what the current landscape looks like in terms of data governance, why it matters, and what changes are suggested in order to improve the current practices in esports data collection. Over the last decade, esports has transformed from casual competition into organized data-driven performance systems, as we're all well aware of as well. Teams now operate very similar to traditional sports clubs. They've got their own analytical teams, nutrition teams, sports science teams as well, breaking down gameplay, communication, training sessions, and using specialized software for analysis as well. Some are even experimenting with biometrics and eye tracking data to measure stress and reaction under pressure. And the idea is kind of anchored by several references, but most notably Lee and colleagues in 2025, which was a systematic review published through Tampa University, which identified several categories of analysis in terms of esports performance, and they ranged in and out of actual data analysis, but fundamentally it showed that esports is now at a level where data is very rich in the industry, and it's used for all sorts of things in terms of performance, recruitment, profile, and future predictive modeling as well. While the analytical sophistication keeps growing, however, the supporting ethical and safeguarding frameworks hasn't developed at the same rate. The widening gap between what we can analyze and what we should has set the stage for the issues explored in this study. When we talk about data in esports, most people will think of gameplay statistics like KD ratios, heat maps, win rates, etc. But increasingly, analysts are measuring far more personal information, behavioral data, including communication logs, reaction time tools, and even voice analysis for emotional detection. Biomechanical and biometric data push this sensitivity even further, motion tracking, webcam posture correction, heat rate and eye tracking systems. Each step up this ladder moves us closer to personally identifiable and physiological information. And kind of on that line as well, under frameworks like the GDPR Article 9, biometric and health-related data are classed as special categories, meaning that they require explicit consent, secure handling, clear retention policies. In traditional sports, as we explore later on in the study as well, these controls already exist. However, in esports, this level of sensitivity isn't always recognized at the grassroots, amateur, and low-level semi-professional level, even though the data itself is being collected. I think initially as well, just one of the contexts I want to give as well is it's really important to understand that esports data ethics is not all data carries the same weight in terms of ethics. Public data and privileged data is sort of how I've separated it, with public data being anything that's accessible to anyone who has the footage, such as a live stream, APIs, match leaderboards, ranked performances, and anyone can access this and anyone can collect that information. It's already in the public domain, so a different level of discretion and governance around that will exist, but it's certainly going to be a lot less than privileged data, which is data that would sit behind closed doors. These are private screen recordings, internal communications, feedback reports, or even biometric data collected during training. The information often contains context around individuals, emotional reactions, health patterns, and behavioral insights, which make that information deeply personal and something that needs to be governed properly. The ethical challenges in grassroots esports is that frequently clubs tend to, or as the data will show later on as well, clubs tend to treat data as public data, where if they've been able to gather it, then surely other people could gather it as well. But it's not necessarily the case. And once that moment moves from public to privileged data, it enters a different legal and moral category that demands structure, consent, and more secure storage as well. Just briefly then as well, I just wanted to touch on why that structure matters. When we talk about structure and data ethics, we're really talking about clarity. In unstructured environments, data is often collected informally, maybe through Discord or spreadsheets, analysis clips that are just sent over via those sorts of communication channels. And consent tends to be implied rather than documented. Players rarely know who controls that data as well. By contrast, however, structured systems bring order and protection. They introduce defined consent processes, secure storage, clear retention timelines, and analysts know their responsibilities and players know their rights. Organizations like the BAS, and BERA emphasize that structure isn't just bureaucracy, but it's the foundation and the scaffolding that allows innovation to continue. The study in particular that I did was designed to map out how data protection and ethical practices are handled in grassroots and low-level semi-professional esports, and to see how that compares to more traditional sports settings. I've used a sample size of several different players, coaches, analysts, performance staff, and then operation and senior club members at club level, as well as people who are head analysts or senior coaches in low-level non-league football. Just as my sample size, was able to gather a lot of survey information, and then what I did with some of those people is I interviewed them a little bit further just to understand the context behind some of that data as well. Kind of on that note though as well was, or sort of the initial findings of the study, I suppose, were to summarize the organizational side of how esports clubs currently handle data. Most esports clubs do have a media or some sort of communication policy. I didn't know the exact level, and that's not something that my study looked into, was the level of depth that went into, just whether it existed or not. And it's good to see that 87% of clubs did have a media or communications policy of some regard, but almost none, at only 8%, had any sort of formal data or safeguarding policy around data collection in that regard. And whilst the second statistic on there as well, or the second set of data as well, the 0% of have a designated data protection officer or someone in that responsible role, it's a little bit of a misleading statistic, I think, but it was still important to include because not many clubs, even in traditional sports, have someone who's just a designated data protection officer at the lower levels. But usually there is, as my data will show as well, there is someone who at least has that responsibility or as part of their main role at the club. And it was interesting to note that not a single person who was surveyed identified themselves or knew of someone at their club who was in charge of that process as well. Typically, footage and analysis files were shared over platforms like Google Drive or Discord without any set rules around how long the data was stored, accessible, or who can see it. And the result is that many clubs are professional in how they present their brand, but not yet professional in how they manage that data behind it. Common practices, as we mentioned before, were that many things were just sent in a somewhat public domain that weren't considered private and confidential. And some of the paraphrase quotes that we got from the survey as well were that a lot of people assume that their media policy document was their data retention policy document and all of the data processes as well. And there seemed to be that not an intentional misuse of data, but not an understanding of how it's supposed to be governed properly in that regard, as further data will go on to show as well. I then also looked at the awareness, the gap, and the perception. I looked at the awareness of players and staff and sort of the gap of the reality and how they presumed it was being presented. So when surveys were sent out, depending on how they identified their role, there was a different set of questions at the end. Ones that I wanted to understand each side's perspective on how it's governed. Maybe one side thought there was like a staff and coaches assumed that they did have policies in place, but players weren't aware of it. But in this instance, the data showed that there's sort of a big gap between reality and what ideally would be happening. Around 2/3 of players said they weren't sure who actually owned their performance data, and nearly 3/4 didn't know where it was stored. More than half believed the data was deleted automatically, which was not the case. And only 11% of players had ever been asked for formal written consent regarding data collection and usage of that data as well. On the staff side as well, there was a similar sort of pattern. Most coaches and analysts and staff around performance who were interviewed for this assume that by sending a clip or being part of a training session implied consent, and almost a third believed the club's media policy doubled up as a data policy as well. It doesn't reflect intentional misuse, but it does reflect an unfamiliarity with data governance, and without awareness, ethical practice is just simply impossible. These findings show a clear need for structure and transparency and education around how data is actually handled. Before presenting my comparison data with the football model as well, I want to explain why I'm making this comparison at all. I do just need to quickly just pop my screen over just to make sure I'm not running over time. Apologies. There we go. That's okay. There we go. Apologies all for that. Before I wanted to explain why I'm making the comparison at all. The findings from esports show a pattern. Clubs rely heavily in esports on informal processes, trust and convenience. There's very little structure around consent and storage, retention, or sort of access to that data as well. And to understand the scale of these gaps and why they're so significant and so important, it made sense to compare esports with a more traditional sport that operates similar performance analysis workflows, but within a more mature ethical and safeguarding framework standards. I wanted to use football just simply for my own personal background in football, working as an analyst, but I didn't compare the top divisions. I, in fact, compared the first division of non-league football all the way down to the fifth division, which is in total the fifth to the ninth division of English football, often regarded as the semi-professional levels at esports. And what I'll show you now is not an idealized picture of what data governance can look like, but a realistic example of what baseline governance should look like in the performance environment. The football findings show a level of structural governance that's almost completely absent in esports. Every club had a media policy of some regard, and 88% had a formal safeguarding or data policy referencing GDPR principles in some way, shape, or form. Importantly, and I think this was very key for the understanding of how young players can be in esports as well, which is also a common finding in football, with many 16 to 17-year-olds competing at this level as well. Written consent was used by 88% of clubs, including for 16 to 17-year-olds, with parental consent being involved in that process as well, demonstrating a clear duty of care awareness. Around 2/3 had defined retention periods, and nearly all used role-based access permissions for data access. Apologies, just lost my train of thought there. These solutions aren't expensive or high-tech solutions, but they do come from established expectations and cultural norms around safeguarding and data. Many of this data just comes from simply having a document and making sure players have access to that document. But just doing that and making sure players are aware of how their data should be used immediately solves a lot of the issues that we are currently seeing in esports. I suppose what this sort of shows that football provides a concrete example that structured governments can exist and what it does currently look like even at non-professional levels. What's striking here, I suppose, as well, is how different this looks from esports. Earlier, we saw that only 12% of esports clubs had a data policy, where here it's 88%, which is quite a stark difference. It's not even a marginal difference in this regard. Written consent was almost universal in football, compared to just 11% in esports. And while football has clear retention, deletion and access rules, esports mostly relies on informal sharing and long-term storage without review. The gap isn't performance capability, but it's just that esports analytics is becoming very advanced, and we just got to make sure that the gap doesn't fall behind in terms of the governance of that analysis. I suppose kind of just building on from that as well, when we put all the findings together, What we see is an ethical maturity gap. Esports as a performance environment is incredibly advanced in terms of what it actually does, but the analysts are using sophisticated tools, biomechanics in their data, communication analysis, match intelligence systems that rival these professional sports. But kind of the main butt of the argument here is that the governance around that data hasn't kept up. Clubs are adopting high-level performance analysis methods without corresponding structure for consent, storage, retention, or access. As a result, data is being handled informally, usually in good faith, and no one's trying to maliciously not make sure the players are aware of their data results by the looks of the data. But without the safeguards that should accompany this kind of information, we do expose, or everyone exposes themselves to potential serious risks in regard to this as well. We also saw that the awareness among players and staff is very low. Most players don't know who owns their data, where it's stored, or how long it's kept. Many staff assume that sending clip equals consent. And in simple cases, maybe with public data, this could be the case. But when it comes to more privileged data and non-public data, it's a different ballgame, and that just isn't the case in that regard. Kind of just to summarize as well, I suppose as well, is just to talk about some of the potential ways to strengthen this situation as well. As I've broken down into the 3 areas that require some sort of an increase in governance and how they can potentially do it in just a broad summary. But for players, the focus is awareness, making sure they understand what's being collected and what rights they have. There's a lot of ways that this can go about it, and there's no perfect solution to fix the system. But evidently, my research shows that just from the small sample size I had, that there's already a lack of awareness of data governance in this regard. For clubs, the emphasis is on simple structure, a few-page policy documents, proper consent forms, basic storage rules, and someone responsible for maintaining them. You know, these actions don't cost any sort of money. They cost a little bit of time, but it's something that'd be very important for the governance of this data as the depth of the data evolves as well. But just doing these simple things would radically improve current practices as well. And finally, for leagues and governing bodies, the role is to make good practice achievable. Templates, minimum standards, and basic training would go a very long way in regards to supporting the clubs in the direction they currently lack. And when all these three levels do their part, the ecosystem can move forward ethically without slowing down innovation. Just sort of a quick conclusion as well, but also talking about some of my future work as well. I mentioned I was a student at Cardiff Metropolitan University as well, and I'm currently doing a study on the integration of analysis at the grassroots and semi-professional level, understanding what that actually looks like and how it exists, how the principles apply. And I kind of wanted to use this research that I got here as sort of a benchmark or like a starting point for when I continue that research to understand maybe why these principles aren't in place. Is it a lack of awareness? Is the lack of is it just a different environment? Obviously, as many of us are aware, at the lower level, esports tends to be online, remote, and it's not always the same. So that's part of the research I'm currently doing to understand why that might be the case. And just as a final last a little bit of a thank you as the 20-minute mark approaches, I just want to say a big thank you to the Esports Research Network again, and many thanks to everyone who's listening in and may have any questions they want to ask as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Patryk. You nailed that in terms of timing. That was a really interesting talk. I've got one question myself, and I've got one question in chat. So I'll start off with my question because I think it will help with the next question, which is about how data has sort of expanded upon. You mentioned it quite heavily in terms of it, but the vast majority of data that we first originally looked at within coaching, I think, in relation to esports, from my perspective as a coach, was it's all publicly accessible data, right? So when we go and scout players, it's mostly accessible public data, sites like op.gd, u.gg, etc. Do you think this has caused like this informal sort of viewpoint, and it's not data protection in relation to it, and this is something it needs, I 100% agree, needs more focus on, but do you think it's produced this sort of like social paradigm where people think that because all this data is accessible that they don't need to have a policy?
You know, that's a very, very great question, actually. And I think I've got a past example I can use in this regard as well. When I was working in sort of those lower levels of English football as well, we had something called Y Scout and an Opta, which was like a yearly subscription we could pay for several £1,000s, but we had access to very insightful match data. I think that because of how much data there was, maybe in the initial stages when analysis was new to the lower levels of English football, we did jump the gun a little bit. We were trying to just use the data as opposed to properly govern it. And I think what you've asked and kind of like addressed is absolutely the case. I think because of how much data can be available, people just assume that it's all in the public domain. But I think as the practices do evolve, and this obviously doesn't look at the professional level where it is a little bit different, but we're starting to see those professional standards kind of drop down to the lower levels as well. We're seeing people look at a reaction time data, joint movements. And maybe the surveys, the data I've shown from the surveys doesn't properly reflect it. But one of the questions that was asked was the sort of data they're collecting and such. And quite a lot of it is public access domain data. And there's nothing wrong with the current standards, I suppose, in that regard, because there's a level of assumption and consent that is given when you enter these tournaments, when you compete in these games, because you know it's going to be broadcasted, you know that anyone has access to that information. But it's just about once that line is crossed, it's very important to make sure that people are educated on that practice. I think a lot of people have probably assumed that the line hasn't been crossed yet, but I think that's partly why I wanted to do this research, was to highlight that that line is probably a lot closer than people think it is. And it's very important that they're educated on the fact that they do need to be more responsible with data that is not public data.
Perfect. That's a great answer. And that actually feeds really well into the next question, which was done by Tobias, which he said, somewhat scary what they do with all of the data, personal data, right? We talked about GDPR. How the data is being treated, but he was looking at AI and how AI is going to sort of look at it, and what are your opinions of AI in terms of data analysis? And then I think that'll be our last question. But there's a few more questions in the chat for you.
That's fine. No worries. I'll just have a quick read of those as well, but I'll answer this one first, of course. I think that's a great question. I think AI is such a hot topic at the moment as well. I think the moment, and like I don't want to jump back to the slide, of course, but maybe just to kind of like visualize my point a little bit is once the data does jump into that privileged data that is not accessible in public, I think at times, and very often it should be treated the same way as medical records and academic research kind of data in that regard. I think there's a very fine line between what is public. Public data can go into large language models, no problem at all. But as soon as it becomes privileged data, part of the structure around how that data is used is that it should not go into a third-party large language model. We're starting to see a lot of cases where university students, for example, are just uploading their findings into large language models, and it's causing a very large safeguarding issue that is currently present in the world. Is there a perfect fix to it? At the moment, probably not right now, just because it's such a new area of development, but it is a very big area for concern as well, because of the fact that the data does then officially become shared. You're essentially sharing public data with someone who is not part of your organization, has not agreed to the safeguarding policies that your club may or may not have in that regard as well. And it's something that, like, from a black and white point of view, shouldn't go into large language models, but it's also one of those difficult things where the benefits of large language models and how it supports the analysis process is not something that can be ignored as well. So it's something that will continue to develop and expand in the industry, but it's a very important aspect of the research as well, I think, in that regard as well. And I'll tell you what.
Thank you very much. Like I said, there's a few other questions in relation to data privacy, etc., in the chat. I'm going to let you look through those in your own time. Fantastic talk, and it's a pleasure to have you once again, as usual, Patryk. I see you quite a lot with Welsh Esports. Good luck with your rest of your season, S.E.A Dragons. Not